For this part of the lecture on aggression, we will be talking about violence and the media. So first of all, even though this has been something that has been debated quite publicly over the last many years now, there is now a wide body of literature that supports the idea that the consumption of violent media is positively related to acts of aggression, meaning that the more violent media people tend to consume, the more violent acts they also are likely to perpetuate. Now, it should be noted that this link is stronger for video games than it is for television, even though it holds for both forms of media. There is also some literature to suggest that this pattern also holds true for violent literature as well. One of the reasons it's thought to be the strongest for video games is because of the active nature that people take part in when playing video games as compared to the more passive watching of television and to some degree equivalent of reading literature. Now, it is not all bad either. It should also be noted that there's a similar pattern found between consuming pro-social media and pro-social acts, meaning that the more pro-social media a person tends to consume, be it video games, literature, or movies, the more likely these people are to also engage in pro-social acts. This was the result of a large-scale meta-analysis that I believe used about 100 different studies and had more than 30,000 people all told that showed this phenomenon. Another factor that is related to both violent media and aggression, or sometimes people argue that it sits in between the consumption of violent media and aggressive behaviors, is desensitization. And so the more one is exposed to violent media, the more desensitized one tends to become to violence around them, both in other forms of media and in the world at large. So a study conducted by Klein, Croft, and Courier in 1973 showed a bunch of people a boxing match that ultimately was quite bloody, and they measured people's physiological arousal. This is oftentimes done through measuring either blood pressure, galvanic skin response, which is how much sweat is on your skin and can be used to measure how aroused a person is, or through things like heart rate. And they found that people who watched quite a bit of television had far less physiological arousal when watching these particular bloody boxing matches as compared to those who did not watch much television, who had a much greater physiological response to watching those matches. In fact, some people of these authors described the ones who watched a lot of television as being basically apathetic to this boxing match. Another more recent study conducted by Bushman and Anderson in 2009 showed that people who had just come out of watching a violent movie were significantly less likely to help a woman struggling to pick up her crutches than those who had just watched a non-violent video. Of course, please don't worry about the woman. She wasn't actually struggling. She was an accomplice of the experimenters. But here you can see that it's not just that people who watch the violent videos, at least in this latter study, were somehow more evil or something along those lines. It was just the thinking here is that they're more desensitized to the pain of others, and it has also been shown a lot in empathy literature that the more we do not empathize with people or dehumanize people or ultimately are just desensitized to their suffering, the less likely we are to engage in helping them. Because if one isn't gaining some material reward and you don't feel anything for the other person, there is no incentive for a human being to help somebody else. Another factor that comes up a lot in violent media consumption is the concept of exacerbation of in-groups and out-groups, or another way to talk about that would be it increases the tendency for us versus them styles of thinking. Again, this phenomena is stronger for video games than it is for television, and is again thought to be due to the more active role that people take when playing video games as compared to watching television. One of the reasons why this is thought to happen is that many movies and games ultimately depict an oversimplified notion of good guys and bad guys, and that the good guys must defeat the bad guys, and oftentimes in order to defeat these quote-unquote bad guys, they are defeated through some type of violence because of course they can't be communicated with, but also one of the reasons that they are rarely ever communicated with in media is because that would not make for exciting and entertaining media, and therefore is almost always these matters settled through violence. Of course, that tends to teach people as they consume this type of media that there are my people who are the good guys and there are those people who are the bad guys, and the only way to ensure that the bad guys won't either infringe on our freedom, steal something from us, or otherwise harm us is by defeating them through violence. And ultimately, this can then translate over into real life forms of thinking, where when we are approached with other types of people in our environment who we might not disagree with, it makes it that much easier to reach for this in-group, out-group style of thinking, which is already unbelievably prevalent in human beings, especially in times of stress. Now, Gretmeier and McClatch, I think that's how you'd say it, in 2011 demonstrated that people were much more likely to dehumanize immigrants after playing violent video games than after playing either neutral or pro-social games. So a neutral game would just be something like Tetris or Sudoku that doesn't really have any moral valence to it. Pro-social games would just be games that involve cooperation or helping each other out, whereas violent games are pretty obvious because many games at the end of the day are actually quite violent. Now, most of the studies that we've talked about so far are conducted in snapshots of time. There are people who come into a laboratory, they take part in an experiment, something about them is measured, and then they're sent on their way. So this does not really tell us very much about what effect watching violent movies or playing violent games over a decade or more is likely to have on individuals. It turns out, though, some people have conducted studies like these. These types of studies are called longitudinal studies, which are just studies that are conducted over extended periods of time. This period of time can be anywhere between several days all the way to many years. One of the longest that I know of that is conducted was a study looking at how personality traits change over time, and I believe that study has been ongoing for nearly 65 years. Now again, this pattern between increased consumption of violent media and increased acts of aggression once again emerges with a positive relationship between both of these two things. So in one of the largest studies of this type, Johnson, Cohen, and Smiles, Casson, and Brooke in 2002 followed 700 families for over the course of 17 years. So they followed them for the 17 years prior to 2002. And here they found again this pattern that the more violent media that was consumed by children and young adults of these families, the more those individuals were likely to go on and commit acts of aggression later on in their lives. Now, another fascinating thing that comes from this is that this relationship remains significant even after controlling for parental education, family income, and the amount of violence in the surrounding neighborhoods. What we mean by that this relationship remained even after controlling for these things is that it is possible that, for example, people with lower parental income, lower education, or a lot of violence in the neighborhood could all be related to increase of acts of aggression later in life. And in fact, these things are actually related to the incidence of aggressive behaviors that people are likely to go on to commit. So what it means by controlling for these is even accounting for the contribution that these factors could have had on the acts of aggression over these children and adolescents' lives, the amount of violent media they consumed still went on to predict the increased acts of aggression that they would likely commit later, removing the contribution of parental education, family income, and surrounding neighborhood violence. Another thing to consider is this concept of the magnification of danger, and this refers to the increased perception that violence takes place around a person or in the world in general. This is oftentimes why people will hear things like, statistically, this is one of the safest times in the history of human beings, but that is so hard to believe because of all of the media and news that we see that show us just atrocity after atrocity being committed. But if it's compared to times where, for example, the Black Death ravaged much of the world, or the Crusades were happening, or just hygiene and antibiotics weren't really a thing that was in common practice, lives were actually very difficult for individuals. It was just in many of those times we did not have access to mass media in the way that we did today, and that prevalence of mass media today can oftentimes warp our perceptions of how much danger actually exists in the world. This is not to say that there are not incredibly dangerous, traumatizing, or just downright violent actions that take place on Earth. Those have continued to happen since the dawn of humanity and are likely to continue to happen for quite a while yet. It's just that our perceptions of how much that take place don't always match up with how much is actually taking place around us and in the world in general. It has been found that the greater the consumption of violent media, the more exaggerated we tend to believe the amount of violence and aggression that takes place around us and in the world. Gerbner, Gross, Morgan, Signorelli, and Shanahan in 2002 demonstrated that people who watched television for more than 4 hours a day had far more exaggerated views of the violence that took place outside their homes than did people who watched television for less than 2 hours a day. Now, they just compared these two groups of people. I'm not sure that this is a linear tracking thing, such that the more television you watch, the more likely you are to have a over-exaggerated perception of danger, or if there is some type of threshold. I will look more into that, and if I remember, I will make a note of it somewhere. It was also found that these people who tended to watch more television than 4 hours a day also were much more likely to fear personal assault on their person and think that it would be much more likely to happen over the course of their lives than those people who watched less television. Again, what we're saying here is not so much that people are not assaulted or that they have no right to fear being assaulted. It is just that when taken on average, people who watch a lot of television are much more fearful about that assault happening, whether or not they live in a place where it is likely for them to be assaulted. This can often be the time or one of the reasons why people who live in small, relatively tight-knit communities oftentimes can greatly fear being assaulted or kidnapped or so on and so forth, even though the likelihood of that ever happening in those types of towns is very little. And a lot of that is tied to our current consumption of media. Also, much of the literature still focuses on video games and television. There is less literature, even though it is beginning to be conducted, on just general consumption of social media and how that has expanded in people's day-to-day use and how that affects our impressions of danger and violence that exist around us or in the world in general. Now, a thing you'll hear a lot that comes up oftentimes by people who would like to downplay the relationship between violent media and violent acts is that it is temperament that is a potential third variable. What we mean by this third variable or the third variable problem is that there is a relationship between aggression and violent media, but that this is not a causal link, such that they believe that it is not violent media that causes an increase in aggression, but rather they oftentimes argue that it is violent temperaments that is related to both, such that a person with a violent personality is more likely to commit acts of aggression, and they're also more likely to seek out violent media, and it is this that leads to the relationship between violent media and aggressive behaviors. And to some degree, this is actually true. Now, it does turn out, though, that temperament ultimately moderates the relationship between violent media or the consumption of that media and an increase in aggressive behaviors. What I mean by moderate by temperament is that temperament, or what style of temperament one has, it changes that relationship between violent media and aggressive behaviors. Specifically, for people who have already violent temperaments, consuming violent media will increase the odds of their aggressive behaviors far more than violent media will increase the odds of aggressive behaviors for people who do not have violent temperaments. In both cases, it is still positively related to aggressive behaviors, but this pattern is much, much stronger or more reliably connected for people who also have violent temperaments or violent personalities. Now, that might sound like violent media is basically the end of the world as we know it, and it's probably not that extreme, even though, again, it does contribute. And ultimately, all of these types of things must be considered in context. What we mean by this is that even though there is a relationship between violent media and aggression, this relationship pales in comparison to the connections between biological factors, so this is in your genes, social factors, what your peer groups are ultimately doing, or examples would be that, economic, right? People who are disenfranchised are much more likely to engage in aggressive behaviors than people who have abundance. Along with psychological factors, these are either mental or distressing factors that could lead to psychological distress. All of these have much stronger links to aggressive behavior and can be used far more effectively to predict the incidence of aggressive behavior. One of the reasons, however, that we continue to hear so much talk about violent media is it is easy to talk about, and it is relatively more straightforward to control and address than biological, social, and economic and psychological factors, not to mention much, much cheaper. After all, can you imagine how difficult it would be to provide economic equality to all people living just in this country, let alone the world? And that's not even talking about some of these other factors, like actually dealing with giving therapy and mental sort of struggle help to people who need it around the world, when there are still huge parts of the world that think that psychological help is for wussies, which is still unbelievably prevalent around the world today. Thus, we spend a lot of time talking about violent media and not as much time talking about some of these other factors that contribute to aggressive behaviors at much higher rates.